His name is known to every student. Christopher Columbus, the man who discovered America. Yet, behind this simple fact found in schoolbooks hides one of the most dramatic, contradictory, and tragic tales of the Age of Discovery. This is the history of how a Genoese navigator, relying on a flash of brilliant intuition and a simultaneous catastrophic error in calculation, managed to persuade the most powerful monarchs in Europe to finance the boldest, riskiest expedition ever attempted. It is the account of a desperate crossing in 3 small caravels through an immense and terrifying ocean. A voyage that nearly ended in mutiny and total failure. It is the narrative of a triumph, of that moment when, after weeks of despair, the longed-for cry of "Land!" finally echoed, and the man who gifted a whole continent to Spain was hailed at home as a hero. But it is also the story of a tragedy. It explains why Columbus, until the very end of his days, remained fanatically convinced that he had found only a new, short route to Asia, and not a new world. It reveals how the great admiral of the ocean sea, viceroy of all discovered lands, ended his life in poverty, oblivion, and iron chains. It was a journey into a world where maps were blank canvases, where myth and reality were tightly interwoven, and where the obsession of a single man managed to forever alter the map of the world. The story of the man who reshaped the globe is riddled with gaps, shadows, and enigmas, beginning with the very moment of his birth. To this day, historians engage in heated debates regarding his true origins. Was he Italian? Was he Spanish? Or perhaps, as some claim, Portuguese? However, the most accepted and documented version places his birth in the year 1451, within the bustling maritime republic of Genoa. He was born into the family of Domenico Colombo, a weaver and wool merchant of humble means and scarce resources. From his earliest infancy, his world was inextricably bound to the sea. In the 15th century, Genoa was not merely a city, it was a maritime superpower, a true mistress of the waves. Her commercial galleys and caravels plowed the waters of the entire Mediterranean, trading from the Pillars of Hercules at Gibraltar to the golden gates of Constantinople. The heavy scents of the harbor, the salt spray, the rotting fish, the acrid tar of the ropes, and the perfume of exotic spices composed the very air the young Christopher breathed. He received no systematic or university education. His school was the wooden deck of a ship. His professors were the rough, weather-beaten captains and sailors who commanded the trade routes. From his teenage years, he began to navigate on merchant vessels, starting as a lowly grummet, a deckhand, performing the hardest, most physical labor, and eventually rising to the rank of a full mariner. It was a school of hard knocks, brutal but invaluable. He learned everything a true man of the sea needed to survive. He mastered the tying of hundreds of intricate knots. He learned to hoist and lower heavy canvas sails in the teeth of a violent storm. He learned to read the path of the ship by the constellations above and the primitive needle of the compass below. His voyages were extensive. He sailed to the island of Chios in search of the prized mastic resin. He traveled to the grey coasts of England and Ireland. It is even possible that on one of these northern voyages, he touched the frozen shores of Iceland, where he may have heard the ancient Nordic sagas whispering of Vinland, a mysterious, fertile land lying far to the west. He saw different nations, heard a babel of languages, and, most importantly, sat in the noisy, smoke-filled taverns of the ports. There he listened with a ravenous hunger to the tales of sailors, stories about distant, unexplored islands that supposedly lay somewhere beyond the horizon, hidden deep within the Sea of Darkness. Around the year 1476, fate intervened in the form of a naval battle off the coast of Portugal. His ship was sunk beneath him. Clinging desperately to a fragment of a floating oar, Columbus miraculously battled the waves and washed ashore in Lisbon. This accidental, tragic episode became the turning point of his existence. He found himself at the absolute epicenter of the world's geographical knowledge. Lisbon, in the late 15th century, was a city obsessed with a single grand idea: the search for a direct maritime route to India. The Portuguese navigators, funded by the legacy of Prince Henry the Navigator and his successors, were moving methodically. Year after year, like tenacious ants, they pushed further south along the unexplored and terrifying coast of Africa, mapping new capes, rivers, and bays. In Lisbon, Columbus worked in the cartography workshop of his brother, Bartholomew. Here, he gained access to the most advanced and often secret knowledge of his time. He studied the Portuguese Portolanos. He read the geographical treatises of the ancients, such as Ptolemy and Strabo. He devoured the Book of Wonders by Marco Polo, which described in vivid detail the incalculable riches of China, Cathay, and the island of Japan, known then as Cipango. He even maintained correspondence with the leading scholars of his age, such as the famous Florentine astronomer Paolo Toscanelli, who was one of the primary defenders of the radical notion that the East could be reached by sailing west. And it was here, in this unique atmosphere of great discoveries, bold hypotheses, and precise calculations, that an idea formed in his mind. It crystallized into the obsession that would define his entire life. It was a concept that seemed brilliant in its simplicity to him, yet absolutely insane to the majority of his contemporaries. While the entire Portuguese nation, the very flower of maritime expertise, focused on reaching the rich markets of India with their spices, silks, and gems by sailing east, circling the long and dangerous coast of Africa, Columbus stood alone in his conviction. He believed one could reach India much more easily and quickly by sailing in the exact opposite direction, straight west, across the Atlantic Ocean. This idea was not entirely new. The fact that the Earth was a sphere had been known to educated men since the time of the ancient Greeks, but between the theory and the practice lay an abyss of sheer terror. In the mind of the medieval man, the Atlantic Ocean was the mare tenebrosum, the sea of darkness. It was perceived as an infinite void, infested with giant sea serpents and monsters, beyond which lay nothing but the edge of the world and the abyss. But Columbus was not merely a dreamer. He was a pragmatist. He sought and collected proof. He listened intently to the sailors of the Azores and Madeira, who claimed that after long storms, the westerly winds had washed strange objects ashore, pieces of wood worked by tools that were not European, carved canoes, and even the bodies of men with unusual, non-European features. He studied maps that depicted mythical islands like Antilia or the Isle of St. Brendan, viewing them not as fiction, but as real undiscovered lands that could serve as stepping stones on the road to Asia. However, the crucial factor was that he, like many geniuses, committed a catastrophic yet ultimately fortunate error in his calculations. Relying on the works of Ptolemy, who vastly underestimated the circumference of the Earth, and on the accounts of Marco Polo, who vastly exaggerated the eastward stretch of the Asian continent, Columbus made a mathematical blunder. He also incorrectly translated Arabic miles into shorter Italian miles. This led him to two absolutely false yet incredibly inspiring conclusions. First, he believed the Earth's circumference was approximately 25% smaller than it actually is. Second, he was convinced that the ocean separating the west coast of Europe from the east coast of Asia was not a formidable barrier. In his worldview, in his figures, there was no gigantic Pacific Ocean, and certainly no massive American continents blocking the way. There was only a relatively small, perfectly navigable sea. According to his math, the The voyage from the Canary Islands to Japan would cover only 4,000 or 5,000 kilometers. The actual distance was nearly 20,000. It was precisely this double, grandiose error that gave him the unshakable, fanatical confidence that other, better-educated scholars lacked. He was absolutely convinced that his project was not only possible, but easy to execute. A voyage that would take no more than a month. Around 1483, he finally made his move. He presented his bold project to King John II of Portugal. He was heard by a special royal junta, a committee of the kingdom's best cosmographers, astronomers, and mathematicians. They examined his calculations with care and without prejudice. Their conclusion was unanimous and devastating for Columbus. They declared that Columbus was radically wrong. The distance to Asia was far, far greater than he claimed. They argued that no ship of that era with limited capacity for water and food could possibly survive such a distance. The project was rejected as a fantasy, totally without foundation. For Columbus, this was a crushing blow. Rejected by the nation that led the world in navigation, he did not surrender. In 1485, following the death of his wife, he took his young son, Diego, and left Portugal. He crossed the border into the neighboring kingdom of Spain to try his luck there. He went to offer his great error, his brilliant dream, to the arch-rivals of the Portuguese crown, the Catholic monarchs Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. Upon arriving in Spain in 1485, Christopher Columbus arrived in Spain as a phantom. He was a nobody, a foreigner with a thick, clumsy Portuguese accent, possessing neither coin nor influence. He walked the dusty roads, dragging a young son by the hand, armed only with a singular, almost demented idea. It was a vision that had already been coldly dismantled and rejected by the greatest scholars of Portugal. Yet he remained obsessed, and this obsession, this fanatical, irrational faith bordering on madness, a belief in his own divine destiny, was the only fuel that kept him moving. His first sanctuary was the monastery of La Rábida, perched on the cliffs near the port of Palos in the southwest. It was a wise choice. The Franciscan friars were not simple hermits. They were men of intellect, deeply learned in geography and astronomy, men whose souls were stirred by the mysteries of the world. They did not laugh at the ragged wanderer. In his feverish eyes, they saw the fire of true conviction. In his calculations, they saw a logic that was perhaps debatable, but undeniably bold and fascinating. The prior of the monastery, Juan Perez, a man who had once served as confessor to Queen Isabella herself, took pity on Columbus. Using his ancient connections at court, he arranged the impossible, an audience with the Catholic monarchs, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. In January of 1486, Columbus stood for the first time before the rulers of Spain in the city of Alcalá de Henares. The scene was surreal. Spain at that moment was not a court of leisure. It was a sprawling, iron-clad military camp. The nation was entirely consumed by the final bloody stage of the Reconquista, the war to crush the Emirate of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula. Every gold coin, every soldier, every thought of the crown was directed toward this holy war. And suddenly, during a brief recess between war councils, this strange figure appeared. Tall, red-haired with burning eyes, he stood amidst generals discussing siege engines and troop movements. Yet he did not speak of war. He began to weave tales of the fabulous wealth of India, of the golden roofs of the great Khan's palaces in China, and of the infinite gemstones of Cipango. He claimed that he, Christopher Columbus, held the key to a short, safe, western route to these treasures. He asked for little: 3 ships, a crew, and royal patronage. King Ferdinand, a cold, cynical, and ruthless pragmatist, was skeptical from the first breath. He saw only another adventurer, a dreamer chasing phantoms. But Queen Isabella was different. She was a woman of profound, passionate religious fervor, prone to bold, almost mystical decisions. To her, the idea was not just about gold. It was a chance to flank the Muslim world and bring the light of Christianity to the countless pagan souls of the East. It was the continuation of her crusade. However, caution prevailed. As in Portugal, they convened a special commission of the kingdom's most reputed scholars, theologians, and cosmographers, presided over by the Queen's confessor, Hernando de Talavera. For Columbus, this marked the beginning of his personal purgatory. These were years of waiting, long, agonizing, and humiliating. They stretched on for nearly 7 years. The commission met intermittently, sometimes after months, sometimes after years. They listened to Columbus, scrutinized his maps, checked his math against the ancients and the Bible. And time and again, they reached the same devastating conclusion as the Portuguese. Columbus was radically wrong. The ocean was too vast. Asia was too far. The project was technically impossible and theologically suspect. For 7 years, Columbus lived on the edge of starvation, surviving on a modest pension the Queen occasionally paid from her own pocket. He was forced to trail behind the royal court like a beggar.
As the war moved, so did he, from Córdoba to Salamanca, from Salamanca to Malaga. He became a laughingstock, a local attraction for the bored courtiers. Behind his back, they whispered and sneered. In the streets, children would stop their games to point fingers at the tall, ragged man, tapping their temples and shouting, "There goes the one searching for a land that does not exist." They called him the visionary, the mad Genoese. He sank into despair. Multiple times he stood on the brink of abandoning everything. He wrote to his brother Bartholomew, who was trying to sell the idea to the courts of England and France. He even secretly approached the King of Portugal again, only to receive polite but firm refusals. 7 years passed. 7 years of hunger, mockery, and a hope that had been ground down to dust. Finally, the Talavera Commission issued its verdict. Rejected. It was early 1492. Columbus, utterly defeated, packed his meager belongings. He rode out of the royal camp at Santa Fe, intending to leave Spain forever and try his luck in France. But then, history shifted. On January 2nd, Granada fell. The last Moorish tower surrendered. The Reconquista, a struggle of 800 years, ended in triumph. Spain was united, free, and euphoric. The royal treasury was absolutely empty, drained by the ruinous cost of war, but the nation's ambition was now limitless. It was in this precise moment, the heartbeat of maximum triumph, that Columbus's friends at court made one final, desperate gamble. Luis de Santangel, the influential royal treasurer who managed the crown's finances, demanded an urgent audience with the Queen. He delivered a speech that changed the trajectory of the world. Santangel did not speak of geography or math. He spoke of politics, glory, and the fear of loss. He argued that the war was over. "Majesty," he urged, "you risk almost nothing. 3 old ships? The cost is dust compared to the war we have just won. But imagine if he is right." He painted a picture of infinite reward, new lands, incalculable treasures, millions of souls for the church. And then the final stroke. Imagine the worst. You deny him. He goes to France. The French king gives him the ships. He succeeds. All the glory, all the gold, all the empire,
will belong to your greatest enemy. Can you permit that? This argument struck the heart of royal pride. Isabella, impulsive and decisive, sent a messenger galloping after the retreating Genoese. Legend says she was even willing to pawn her own jewels to fund the fleet, though in reality the money was scraped together from loans and confiscated assets. On April 17, 1492, in the military camp of Santa Fe, amidst the ruins of the conquered kingdom, the famous Capitulations of Santa Fe were signed. The terms Columbus had secured, after being treated as a beggar for 7 years, were nothing short of imperial. He was named Admiral of the Ocean Sea for life. He was declared Viceroy and Governor-General of all continents he might discover. He was granted 1/10 of all riches extracted from those lands, and most incredibly, these titles were to be hereditary, passed down to his sons forever. The weaver's son had negotiated a contract worthy of a king. He had won the impossible. Now, only one task remained: to find the ships and the men willing to follow a madman to the edge of the world. With the royal decree signed and funding secured, Columbus rode for the port of Palos de la Frontera. This destination was no accident. The crown had chosen Palos as punishment for some forgotten offense, ordering the town to equip 2 caravels for the admiral at their own expense. But a royal command is one thing. The reality of a gritty port town is another. From the very beginning, the preparation became a nightmare. No sane sailor wanted to join what every experienced captain considered a suicide mission. The idea of sailing west, straight into the sea of darkness until land appeared, seemed like pure madness. When recruiters walked the docks, sailors literally hid in taverns or fled to neighboring villages. Ship owners refused to lease their vessels, terrified they would never see them again. To the locals, Columbus was a stranger, a Genoese with strange ideas and arrogant manners. He was met with open hostility and a wall of silence. The expedition was saved by one man, Martín Alonso Pinzón. He was the wealthiest, most respected shipowner and captain in all of Andalusia. Unlike the others, Pinzón was an adventurer. In Columbus's madness, he saw opportunity, a chance for incalculable wealth and eternal glory. Whether he believed the math is doubtful, but he believed in the obsession. Pinzón not only provided one of his best caravels, the Pinta, but he used his immense authority to personally recruit the crew. He walked among his fellow townsmen, promising mountains of gold. And the men followed him. They followed Pinzón, not Columbus. By late July, the flotilla was finally assembled. It consisted of 3 ships. The flagship was the Santa Maria, a large but heavy and slow 3-masted now, rented because Columbus had no ship of his own. It was the lumbering beast of the squadron. Then came the 2 caravels, light, fast, and agile. The Pinta, commanded by Martín Alonso Pinzón himself, and the Niña, captained by his brother, Vicente Yáñez Pinzón. In total, about 90 souls boarded the wooden shells. There were tough Andalusian sailors, royal officials to record the glory, an interpreter fluent in Arabic and Hebrew to speak with the great Khan of Asia, and even a jeweler to appraise the gems they were sure to find. On August 3, 1492, at dawn, after a solemn mass and tearful farewells on the shore, the 3 small ships, toys by modern standards, slipped out of the harbor. They set a course for the Canary Islands, the last bastion of civilization before the leap into the absolute unknown. They spent nearly a month in the Canaries. The Pinta lost her rudder almost immediately. Columbus was certain it was sabotage.
They repaired the ships, restocked fresh water, firewood, and provisions. Finally, on September 6th, the flotilla left the known world behind. Catching the trade winds, they turned their bows directly west into the immense, terrifying myth of the Atlantic. The longest and most feared journey in human history had begun. The first days passed with surprising ease. The winds were steady and favorable. The skies were clear. The ships surged westward at a brisk 10 or 11 knots. But with every passing sunset, as the last known land vanished from memory, a silent unease began to grow on the decks. It soon curdled into a dull, animal terror. These sailors were used to coasting, guided by familiar capes and stars. Now, they looked with horror at a horizon that was identical on all four sides, a vast, empty, hostile blue. They had never been this far from God's earth. To maintain morale and hide the terrifying truth, Columbus kept 2 logs. One was the official log shown daily to the crew, in which he deliberately understated the distance traveled. The other was secret, kept only for his own eyes, recording the true, vast distance they had crossed into the abyss. He knew that if the men realized how far they had gone, panic would be instant. A week passed, then another. No land. Life on board became a monotonous torture. Every day was a mirror of the last. Rise at dawn, a brief prayer, a meager meal of worm-infested hardtack and salted meat, eaten in the dark so as not to see the decay. Then the exhausting routine: handle the sails, pump the bilge, scrub the decks. Under the scorching sun by day and the cold, damp dark by night, the crew began to mutter. Superstitious men gathered in the shadows, whispering, casting hateful glances at the Forgotten Admiral standing alone on the quarterdeck, staring west. They were convinced he was a madman who had sold his soul to the devil, leading them to certain death. They feared they had passed the point of no return, that the constant east wind would never let them sail home. Columbus, sensing the rising mutiny, tried to rally them. He used all his eloquence. He pointed to every tiny sign: birds flying overhead, patches of river algae floating in the brine, changes in the twilight sky. But the days dragged on, and the horizon remained empty. By early October, 35 days out from the Canaries, the crew's patience snapped. On the flagship, the Santa Maria, open mutiny erupted. Armed with knives and axes, the sailors surrounded the admiral's cabin. They demanded he turn the ships around immediately, threatening to throw him overboard if he refused. It was the critical moment of the expedition. Columbus stood alone against a furious armed mob. Here, he showed not just courage, but incredible psychological genius. He did not threaten them with royal wrath. Instead, he bargained for his life and his dream. He asked for 3 more days, just 3 days. If no land was sighted by then, he swore on his honor to turn back. The crew, after angry debate, grudgingly agreed. It was a desperate gamble. Columbus himself was at his limit. His fanatical confidence was beginning to crack. The hours of waiting were agonizing. 1 day passed, 2, still nothing. The tension on board was a physical weight. Then, on the evening of October 10th, undeniable signs appeared. Sailors on the Pinta fished a fresh green reed from the water, and then a small wooden plank, carved by human hands. Hope, nearly extinguished, roared back to life. Columbus ordered the fleet not to sleep. They shortened sail to avoid crashing into the coast in the dark. Eyes strained against the blackness until they ached. He promised a lifetime pension of 10,000 maravedis to the first man to spot land. At 2 in the morning, on October 12, 1492, the lookout on the Pinta, Rodrigo de Triana, peering into the moonlight,
let out a scream that tore through history.
Terra! Terra!
Far in the distance, pale under the moon, lay a white strip of sandy beach. It was salvation. It was triumph. It was the end of the nightmare. On the morning of October 12th, Christopher Columbus, dressed in his finest scarlet doublet, holding the royal standard of Castile and Aragon, stepped onto the shore of a small, lush island he named San Salvador. He fell to his knees, kissed the ground he had suffered so much to find, and wept tears of gratitude to God. He was absolutely, unshakably convinced he had reached his goal. He believed he was somewhere in Asia, on one of the thousands of islands off the coast of India. For this reason, he called the amazed but friendly locals who came to greet him Indians. This monumental geographical error would be fixed in language forever. Columbus had not found what he sought. He had found something immeasurably greater. He had found a new world. Upon the island the natives called Guanahani, Columbus planted the royal standard of Castile and Aragon, immediately baptizing it San Salvador. To the Europeans, this encounter felt like stepping into the pages of a chivalric romance or a biblical description of paradise. After long, agonizing months on a salty, empty, and monotonous ocean, their eyes were assaulted by an explosion of color and life. The coast was a wall of dense, exuberant, emerald green vegetation. The trees looked nothing like those in Europe. They were giants with enormous leaves and exotic fruits. The air was warm, humid, and sweet, impregnated with a dense and intoxicating aroma of unknown flowers. The crystal-clear turquoise water of the lagoon was so transparent that one could distinguish every pebble and every colorful fish swimming on the bottom. But the greatest miracle, the biggest shock for them, was the people. From the dense undergrowth of the coast, without fear or aggression, emerged the local inhabitants, the Taino people. They were completely naked. Their bodies were lithe and well-formed, with a beautiful copper tone. Their faces, with high cheekbones and straight black hair, expressed no hostility, but rather a pure, childlike curiosity. They showed neither fear nor anger. On the contrary, they watched with awe as these strange, bearded arrivals, wrapped in heavy clothes and shining armor, stepped onto their sands holding incomprehensible objects. They offered the Spaniards simple gifts: balls of cotton thread, tamed parrots of vivid colors that screamed in an unknown language, and exotic fruits. Columbus, still fanatically convinced he was on the periphery of Asia, in one of the thousands of islands off the coast of India, immediately called these people Indians. He described them in his logbook with enthusiasm, but also with the cold, pragmatic condescension of a colonizer. They are very gentle people, without knowledge of evil or of killing others. They are the best people in the world. But behind this superficial admiration lay a sober and cynical calculation. He noted immediately for his monarchs: they are fit to be ordered about and made to work. They should be good Christians. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. Yet, Columbus's main objective was not souls nor slaves. His singular, absorbing obsession was gold. He saw that some of the natives wore small gold ornaments in their noses, and this became his confirmation. He was on the right path. There was gold here. He began his interrogation. Through gestures and drawings in the sand, he tried to find out where they obtained this yellow metal. Gold. Cipango. The Great Khan. The natives, not understanding his language and wishing to be rid of these insistent and terrifying strangers, simply pointed towards the south or the west, indicating that far away There was a great island where the chiefs wore massive gold bracelets. Taking these vague gestures as precise directions, Columbus began his feverish, almost demented tour of the Caribbean islands. He discovered Cuba, which astonished him with its size. He was certain it was the continent, the coast of China. He even sent an embassy into the interior with a letter for the Great Khan, but the ambassadors found no imperial palaces, only humble native villages. Then he reached Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic, an island that impressed him with its beauty, fertility, and above all, the apparent abundance of gold dust in its rivers. It was a strange and surreal navigation. The ships, those small splinters of wood, crept slowly along unknown and paradisiacal coasts, mapping new bays and capes. Every day brought new discoveries and new, bitter disappointments. They found virgin, breathtaking nature. They found landscapes that seemed otherworldly.
They found friendly natives willing to trade gold nuggets for cheap trinkets like broken plate shards or copper bells. But they did not find the main thing. There were no rich, populous cities, no palaces with golden roofs, no caravans loaded with spices. It was not the fabulous, civilized India that Marco Polo had described. It was a different world, strange, primitive, and wild. Relations with the natives, which had been almost idyllic at first, began to deteriorate rapidly. The sailors, who had spent months at sea and were tired of abstinence, began to behave with brutality. They stole food from the natives, demanded women, and took their modest gold ornaments by force. Trust turned into fear, and fear turned into hatred. During this same period, the first crack appeared in the expedition itself. Martín Alonso Pinzón, the captain of the fast caravel Pinta, was an ambitious man who considered himself, not Columbus, to be the true hero of this voyage. Hearing a native legend about a mythical island of gold called Babeque and disobeying a direct order from the admiral, he separated from the flotilla during the night and went in search of treasure on his own. Columbus was left with only 2 ships. One of them, his flagship, the Santa Maria, was the slowest and clumsiest. And then, on Christmas Eve of 1492, catastrophe struck. After a festive dinner, when the entire crew, exhausted from the watch, was fast asleep, the helmsman on duty violated all naval regulations. He handed the tiller to a young cabin boy and went to sleep. In the silence of the night, the Santa Maria, dragged quietly by the current, drifted gently onto a coral reef off the coast of Hispaniola. There was no violent crash, but the ship was lost. The waves, though small, began to smash her hull against the coral. The masts collapsed. The flagship of the expedition, the pride of Columbus, was turning into a pile of debris before his eyes. Columbus found himself in a desperate situation, seemingly without exit. He had only one ship left, the smallest one, the Niña, which physically could not hold all the surviving sailors for the long and dangerous voyage back to Spain. But even in this catastrophe, Columbus, a deeply religious man prone to seeing signs of destiny in everything, saw not a failure, but a signal from Providence. He decided it was a sign that they must found the first Spanish colony right there, on that blessed land. Using the wreckage of the Santa Maria and the help of the local natives ruled by the friendly cacique Guacanagari, they built a small fort with a tower and a moat. They named it La Navidad, Christmas, since the shipwreck had occurred on that holy day. In the fort, Columbus left about 40 of his men, giving them strict orders to find the supposed gold mines, keep peace with the natives, and await his return. In early January, the Pinta and Martín Pinzón returned, having found no island of gold. Columbus, swallowing his rage because he understood that without a second ship he could not return, received the prodigal captain. Now, in the 2 remaining caravels, crowded and battered, they could finally depart for home to bring the incredible news to Spain.
The return voyage was even more terrifying than the journey out. If the trade winds had pushed them gently west, they now had to fight against contrary winds and the ferocious winter storms of the North Atlantic. In mid-February, the ships were caught in a monstrous hurricane that raged for several days. In the complete darkness, amidst giant, roaring waves, the Pinta and the Niña lost sight of each other. Columbus, aboard his tiny Niña, which creaked and groaned under every wave, was certain his ship would sink at any moment. He feared that the news of his great discovery would perish with him in the abyss. And then he performed his most famous, almost theatrical act.
On a piece of parchment, he briefly described everything he had discovered. He asked whoever found it to deliver it to the Queen of Spain. He sealed the parchment in a wooden barrel and cast it into the raging ocean. He wanted history to know of his triumph, even if he himself died. But the Niña survived by a miracle. Battered, with broken masts, she finally limped into the Azores, and after enduring another terrible storm, she reached the coast of Portugal, the very country that had once rejected his project with disdain. King John II, hearing of his return and his incredible discoveries, summoned him immediately. It was a tense meeting, full of veiled threats. The king accused Columbus of violating treaties and invading the Portuguese sphere of influence. But Columbus was no longer a humble petitioner. He was a victor, the admiral of the ocean sea, viceroy of new lands, and he behaved with boldness and defiance. Finally, on March 15, 1493, 7.5 months after his departure, the Niña of Christopher Columbus sailed into the same port of Palos from which he had departed into the unknown. And on that very same day, guided by Providence or a shifting wind, the Pinta of Martin Pinzon also arrived, having miraculously survived the storm. The circle had closed. The incredible voyage that changed the world had ended. The news of Columbus's return and his incredible discoveries spread across Spain like wildfire. What had seemed a reckless adventure had transformed into the greatest of triumphs. The admiral, whom barely a year prior was considered a madman, was now a national hero. His journey from Palos to Barcelona, where the royal court resided at that moment, became a ceaseless, triumphal march. In every town he passed, exultant crowds poured into the streets to see him, to gaze upon the man who had returned from the other world. But the primary object of their curiosity was his exotic entourage. Columbus brought living proof of his discovery. Several Taíno natives adorned with colorful feathers, cages with never-before-seen parrots screeching in strange tongues, unknown plants, and, most importantly, gold. Nuggets, gold dust in glass vials, and simple yet promising golden ornaments from the natives. The reception at the royal court in Barcelona was organized with maximum pomp. Isabella and Ferdinand received him not as a simple captain, but as the greatest of Spain's grandees. In his presence, they stood up, an unheard-of honor. They seated him beside them, and for hours, with bated breath, listened to his tale. Columbus was at the summit of the world. He spoke of paradise islands, of good-hearted natives who would be easily converted to Christianity, and above all, of the incalculable reserves of gold he was certain lay just beyond the horizon. He was absolutely convinced he had reached the coasts of Asia, and that the islands he had discovered were merely the antechamber to the fabulously rich lands of China and Japan. The monarchs were enchanted. They confirmed all his titles and privileges granted in the capitulations of Santa Fe. He was admiral of the ocean sea, viceroy and governor-general of all discovered lands. He received his own coat of arms. They showered him with honors and coin. Immediately, preparations began for a second expedition. But this time,
It was no longer a small, risky adventure. It was a massive, colonial operation on a state scale. Instead of 3 old caravels, a full armada of 17 ships set sail. Instead of 90 adventurous sailors, 1,500 people boarded. Soldiers, officials, priests, craftsmen and farmers. They carried not only weapons, but horses, livestock, seeds and tools. They sailed not to discover, but to populate and develop. But already during this second expedition, which began in 1493, the first disturbing cracks began to appear in the myth of the Paradise Lands. When the fleet arrived at Hispaniola, at the site where Columbus had left the fort of La Navidad, a terrible spectacle awaited them. The fort had been reduced to ashes, and the 40 Spaniards he had left behind were murdered. What happened remains unclear. Either they fought among themselves over gold and women, or their cruelty toward the local Indians finally provoked a bloody vengeance. The idyllic first contact had ended. The era of conquest had begun. Columbus founded a new colony, La Isabela, but from the start it was doomed. The colonists, who'd crossed the ocean in search of easy gold, were unprepared for hard labor. Unknown tropical diseases decimated them. Hunger set in. The gold, which was supposed to be gathered from the ground as Columbus had promised, did not exist. It had to be extracted with hard, exhausting labor in the mines. And here, the dark side of Columbus manifested. From a brilliant navigator, he transformed into a cruel and absolutely inept administrator. He did not know how to govern men. He tried to force Spanish hidalgos, who considered physical labor a humiliation, to work in the mines. He imposed a brutal system of tribute upon the Indians. Every tribe was obliged to deliver a certain quantity of gold dust every 3 months. Those who failed to meet the quota were punished brutally by having their hands cut off. The friendly Taínos, whom he once described as the best people in the world, now died by the thousands in the mines from diseases brought by Europeans, or committed suicide, unable to endure the slave labor. The colony plunged into chaos. The Spaniards mutinied, the Indians rebelled. Endless complaints reached Spain accusing Columbus and his brothers of tyranny, incompetence, and hiding royal revenues. His second and third expeditions brought new geographical discoveries. He found the Lesser Antilles, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and explored the coast of South America. But he never found the main prize, a direct route to India and its incalculable riches. His reputation at court vanished day by day. In 1500, during his third voyage, the crown's patience ran out. They sent a special royal inspector, Francisco de Bobadilla, to the colony with unlimited powers. Upon arriving in Hispaniola and seeing the reigning chaos, Bobadilla, without a second thought, arrested Columbus and his 2 brothers. The unthinkable happened. The admiral of the ocean sea, the viceroy of the Indies, the man who had gifted Spain a new world, was shackled like a common criminal and thrown into the brig of a ship bound for Spain to face trial. It was the apex of his humiliation. When he arrived in Cadiz, the news of his arrest caused shockwaves in the country. The monarchs, naturally, ordered his immediate release and summoned him to court. They restored his fortune, but they did not restore his titles, and, most importantly, his power. His monopoly on discovery had been destroyed. Dozens of other captains, younger and luckier, had already launched themselves west, discovering new lands and bringing real, not mythical, treasures to Spain. The star of Columbus had extinguished. The return to Spain in chains. The end of the year 1500 marked the most terrible humiliation of Christopher Columbus's life. When the ship docked in Cadiz, witnesses recounted that he refused to allow his chains to be removed until he stood personally before the king and queen. He wanted the monarchs to see with their own eyes exactly how they had treated the man who had gifted them an empire. The news of the arrest of the Admiral of the Ocean Sea caused a genuine scandal throughout Spain. Isabella and Ferdinand, naturally, ordered his immediate release, paid him financial compensation, and received him at court with outward displays of respect. But it was nothing more than hypocrisy. The humiliating accusations of tyranny and incompetence brought against him by the royal inspector were dropped, but the essence remained unchanged. Columbus was a brilliant navigator, but an absolutely inept ruler. His time had passed. His monopoly on discovery and all the royal powers granted in the capitulations of Santa Fe were, in effect, stripped away. A different man was appointed as the new governor of Hispaniola. Dozens of other captains, younger, luckier, and more pragmatic men, like Amerigo Vespucci, Alonso de Ojeda, and Vicente Pinzon, were already launching themselves west. They were exploring and mapping new coasts, and unlike Columbus, they were beginning to understand that this was a separate, new continent. Columbus, meanwhile, remained at court, obsessed with one final and desperate idea. He continued to fanatically believe that the lands he had discovered were Asia. He was convinced that somewhere between those islands, a strait must exist, a passage that would lead him from the Caribbean Sea directly into the Indian Ocean, to the fabulous riches of India. He believed that if he found this strait, he would recover his glory, his wealth, and the respect of the crown. For 2 years, he begged in the corridors of power, pleading, arguing, and displaying his maps. Finally, in 1502, the monarchs, perhaps simply wishing to be rid of the insistent old man, granted him permission for a fourth and final voyage. But the conditions were humiliating. He was given 4 old, battered ships and was strictly forbidden from docking at Hispaniola, the main port of the very colony he himself had founded. This voyage was marked by misfortune from the very start. When Columbus, now over 50 years old, approached the coast of Hispaniola, his immense maritime experience allowed him to predict the arrival of a terrible hurricane. He asked the new governor for permission to take refuge in the port. The governor mocked him and refused. At that exact moment, a massive fleet of 30 ships, loaded with gold destined for the Spanish treasury, was leaving the harbor. Columbus begged them not to set sail. They laughed at him again. He took his 4 small ships and managed to find shelter in a hidden bay. The next day, a hurricane of monstrous force slammed into the island. Of the 30 ships in the gold fleet, 25 sank. Hundreds of people died, including Columbus's chief enemy, the inspector Bobadilla, who had arrested him. Yet Columbus's 4 old ships, battered but intact, emerged from their refuge. To him, it was a clear sign of God's judgment. He continued his journey westward in a desperate search for the mythical strait. He explored the entire coast of Central America, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama. It was an agonizing and exhausting odyssey. The ships were being eaten alive by shipworms, marine mollusks that bored through the wood, and they leaked constantly. The crew was decimated by tropical diseases. The natives received them with increasing hostility, and the strait did not appear. In the end, having lost 2 ships, and with the remaining 2 barely afloat, Columbus was forced to turn back. But they never made it to Hispaniola. The ships were disintegrating beneath their feet. He was forced to ground them on the coast of the island of Jamaica. Thus began the final and most humiliating chapter of his odyssey. The great admiral, the discoverer, found himself in the role of a castaway. He and his crew spent an entire year on Jamaica in complete isolation, suffering from hunger and the hostility of the natives, who eventually refused to give them food. And here, Columbus performed his final act of genius, almost mystical in nature.
He knew from his astronomical tables that a total lunar eclipse was due to occur on February 29, 1504. He summoned the native chiefs and announced that his god, in punishment for their lack of hospitality, had decided to steal the moon from them. When, at the appointed hour, the moon truly began to turn blood red and vanish from the sky, the terrified natives threw themselves at his feet, begging him to return the celestial body and promising to bring him all the food he needed. Columbus, after praying in his cabin to time the event, returned the moon. The food supply was restored. Only a year later, one of his faithful officers managed to paddle a small canoe to Hispaniola to bring help. Exhausted and sick, Columbus and the remnants of his crew were finally rescued. In 1504, he finally returned to Spain, but it was the return of a ghost. He was old, sick, and broken. His primary protector, Queen Isabella, was on her deathbed. After her passing, he was forgotten almost entirely. The last 2 years of his life were spent in Valladolid, in a modest house, engaged in endless and humiliating lawsuits with the crown, trying to recover his lost titles and rents. But no one listened to him anymore. He died on May 20th, 1506, in poverty and almost total oblivion. He died without fully understanding what he had actually discovered. Until his final day, he was absolutely and fanatically convinced that he had only found a new route to the old, known Asia.
The irony of fate decreed that the new continent he gifted to the world would not bear his name, but that of another Italian, Amerigo Vespucci, who merely described these new lands. Thus ended the path of a man whose great error became the greatest of discoveries, a path that began with triumph and ended in oblivion. But his true and immortal legacy was only just beginning its march through history. The death of Christopher Columbus. The death of Christopher Columbus in Valladolid in 1506 passed almost unnoticed. There were no state funerals, no grandiloquent eulogies spoken in the plazas. The great admiral of the ocean sea, the man who had literally expanded the frontiers of the known world, died in the cold shadow of oblivion. He passed away as a nagging petitioner who had lost his final legal battle against the crown. His body was buried first in Valladolid, then moved to Seville, and later, in accordance with his will, transported across the ocean to the island of Hispaniola, which he had discovered. From that point on, his physical traces are lost in the currents of the centuries. Today, several cities in different parts of the world dispute the right to house his bones. His posthumous destiny turned out to be just as restless and agitated as his life. What then is his legacy? It is a colossus, immense, contradictory, and deeply tragic. On one hand, Columbus is, without a doubt, one of the key figures in the history of humanity. His voyage of 1492 was not merely another discovery, it was a point of no return. It was an event that severed history into a before and an after. It ended the Middle Ages and ignited the modern age. It finally closed the geographical map of the world, connecting two hemispheres that had developed in complete isolation for tens of thousands of years. He was a brilliant navigator. His courage, his unshakable, almost demented faith in his idea, his capacity to lead men in absolutely desperate situations, and his raw talent for reading the sea, all of this is unquestionable. He was not the first European to reach the shores of America. The Vikings had done so 500 years before him. But it was his discovery that had irreversible consequences. After him, the path to the New World remained open, and through that door flowed a current that could never again be stopped. His voyages initiated the Columbian Exchange, the greatest transfer of goods, cultures, plants, and animals in history between the Old and New Worlds. From America to Europe came the potato, the tomato, corn, cocoa, and tobacco, products that forever altered the cuisine and economy of Europe. From Europe to America came horses, cows, wheat, and the vine. But along with them came invisible killers. And here begins the second, dark face of his legacy. The discovery of America became a catastrophe, a genocide for its indigenous population. The diseases brought by the Europeans, smallpox, measles, influenza, against which the Indians had no biological immunity, decimated up to 90% of the continent's population, according to various estimates. It was one of the most terrifying demographic collapses in the history of the human species. Columbus himself, as we have seen, was a cruel and inept administrator. His thirst for gold and his inability to govern the colonies initiated a brutal system of exploitation and slavery that would reign in the New World for centuries. The friendly Taino people, who had once received him with gifts, were practically annihilated in the span of a few decades. And finally, there is the greatest tragedy of Columbus himself, the tragedy of his genius. He made the greatest discovery, yet he never understood it. Until his very last breath, he was absolutely and fanatically convinced that he had only found a new western route to the old, known Asia. He died believing that Cuba was part of China and that South America was the earthly paradise described in the Bible. He sought one thing and found something immeasurably greater, but he was never able to grasp the magnitude of his own feat. The irony of fate also decreed that the vast new continent would not be baptized with his name, but with that of another Italian navigator, Amerigo Vespucci. Vespucci was simply one of the first to express the bold conjecture that the discovered lands were not Asia, but a completely new continent, a mundus novus, a new world. So who was this man? A hero or a villain? A genius or a madman with luck? A discoverer or the first colonizer? He was all of these things at the same time. He was a product of his time, a cruel religious era hungry for gold and glory. He was a man whose great error became the greatest of discoveries. And his story serves as an eternal and tragic reminder that great geographical discoveries and great human tragedies are often two sides of the same coin. And that sometimes, to discover a new world, one must first lose oneself in the old one.